Hello and welcome to ELA Plus, your free guide to English studies and the English language arts. I'm your host, Brian E. Denton. In today's video lesson, we're going to read and analyze William Shakespeare's Sonnet No. 9. Sonnet No. 9 is, in my opinion, unjustly maligned critically, and deserves to be ranked among the best of the sonnets, or at least among the best of the procreation sonnets. I hope after this video lesson, you'll agree with me. Let's get started. The first thing we're going to do in this video lesson is read Sonnet No. 9. We'll follow this reading up with a contemporary plain English articulation of the poem. After that, I'll share with you some of the criticism surrounding the piece. Then I'll tell you why I disagree with this criticism and believe that Sonnet No. 9 is actually one of the stronger poems in the procreation portion of this sonnet cycle. I'll focus on its phonaesthetics and its message, both of which are superb. As always, we'll conclude with some comprehension questions. Here at ELA Plus, we read poetry a bit differently. We do not read poetry quickly and flippantly. We read poetry intelligently. For an in-depth exploration of how to read poetry intelligently with the ELA Plus method, please see our video lesson, How to Read a Poem, linked to down in the description. In a nutshell, however, just understand that with our method, we first read a poem to ourselves, and then we read the poem out loud. So right now, I'd suggest you pause this video and read the poem to yourself if you have not already. After that, we can read the poem out loud together, which is what I'm going to do right now. Is it for fear to wed a widow's eye that thou consumest thyself in single life? Ah, if thou, issueless, shalt hap to die, the world will wail thee like a makeless wife. The world will be thy widow, and still weep, that thou no form of thee hast left behind, when every private widow well may keep, by children's eyes, her husband's shape in mind. Look what an unthrift in the world doth spin shifts but his place, for still the world enjoys it. But beauty's waste hath in the world an end, and kept unused, the user so destroys it. No love toward others in that bosom sits, that on himself such murderous shame commits. Okay, so that's William Shakespeare's Sonnet No. 9. Here's how I would articulate the poem in contemporary plain English. I'll do this on a quatrain by quatrain and concluding couplet basis. Are you really wasting your life in singleness because you're afraid to get married and have kids? Because in the event of your untimely death, you'll make your widow cry? Don't you know that if you die childless, the entire world will cry like a wife who has lost her husband? The world will be your widow and cry forever because you did not leave a copy of yourself behind. But if you had left a copy behind, your wife would still be able to see you and her children. A spendthrift just moves money around. The money doesn't disappear. But if beauty is wasted by not reproducing, the world does lose the beauty forever. That beauty is destroyed. The person who would do that has no love for others and commits an outrageous act of shameful murder. So that's my contemporary plain English version of the sonnet. I offer these just to help you understand on a surface level what the poem is about. Sometimes Shakespeare's early modern English is a bit difficult to understand. The only other thing I'd add here to help you understand the poem on a surface level is to define for you some of its archaic language. In my estimation, there are two archaic words in this poem. The first archaic word is hap. This word means simply chance or happen. So the speaker is saying in this line, if you without children happen to die. The other archaic word is makeless. Makeless means without a mate or a match. So the line would read, the world will wail thee like a wife without a mate. So with that, having read the poem and offered a contemporary plain English version, and also having cleared up our understanding of some of the archaic language, I'd say we now have a pretty firm understanding of the poem, at least on a surface level, and we're ready to get into our analysis. Let's begin our analysis with some of the criticism of the poem. Simply put, this isn't the most popular of poems. In fact, critically speaking, this poem is kind of like The Godfather 3 of the cycle, a disappointing addition to an otherwise classic whole. Let's see what the villain of this series, Don Patterson, has to say about the poem in order to get a better understanding of this negative critical appraisal. First of all, Don Patterson takes issue with the opening line. He just doesn't buy it at all that the thought of some presently unknown future widow lamenting the young man's death is what keeps the young man single. Patterson calls this a dodgy premise. He's not too kind about the rest of the poem either. He concludes his short essay on the sonnet with these scathing remarks. This is rubbish. More to the point, there's no way Shakespeare doesn't know it. Why might he reprint this stuff? Is it because their still flattered recipient, nearly 15 years later, is now coughing up the money for the quarto? Not the wildest theory. This awful poem is the best evidence yet that the procreation sonnets were work undertaken for hard cash. Harsh words from Don Patterson. And just to be clear what he's talking about when he talks about hard cash and the still flattered recipient, Shakespeare most likely wrote these sonnets for various patrons. For more information on the sonnets as a whole, please see our video lesson, Introduction to Shakespeare Sonnets. I'll link to it down in the description. And just real quick before we move on, of course Shakespeare wrote these sonnets for hard cash. Susanna, Judith, and Hamlet had to eat, and the second best bed wasn't going to leave itself to Anne Hathaway. That note aside, the rest of the critical commentary on this particular sonnet isn't much warmer than that of what Don Patterson has to offer. The critical appraisal ranges generally from tepid to negative. Sonnet number 9 is not a favorite. It's actually considered a fairly poor poem. Well, like a reply guy, I'm here to tell you that most of the critics are wrong. This is actually a pretty good poem. This is a pretty good poem for two reasons. First, in my opinion, sonnet number 9 has a positive pro-social message. And secondly, its phonaesthetics are wonderful and masterful. So what is this pro-social message? Basically, the idea here is that reproduction, having children, is not only good for the individual, but also for society as a whole. So good, in fact, that even the inevitable sadness that accompanies the loss of a loved one is not a cost sufficient to exceed the benefits of the joy and love that is born of family life. Now, I don't know about you, but to me, this is a beautiful message, and I agree with it completely. Just 2 quick points about this poem I think will suffice to express my feelings about its message. First, Don Patterson is, once again, wrong. He claims that this first quatrain is ludicrous. He believes that there's no way the young man would avoid getting married and having kids just because he doesn't want to turn a woman into a widow. Patterson must not be familiar with the internet, the world's depository for all manner of ridiculous ideas. Find any antinatalist screed online, and you're bound to encounter any number of arguments against procreation, just as, if not more absurd, than the young man's argument here. I don't need to get into the whole litany. You're probably already familiar with the most common. You shouldn't have kids because they contribute to climate change. You shouldn't have kids because the world is too evil and full of suffering. Though as a New York sports fan recently, perhaps this one has some validity to it. Anyway, you get the picture. The young man's complaint, while absurd, is not more absurd than the standard antinatalist argument you're likely to encounter these days. Now, whether or not you want to have children is a personal matter. It's no one's business but your own. All I'm saying is that the young man's worry that he'll predecease his wife and make her a widow is not as outlandish an argument as the other antinatalist arguments that we're familiar with today. Finally, in terms of this poem's message, I'd also point out that the speaker is not only making an appeal to the young man individually, but the speaker is also making a social argument. That is, the speaker argues that having children is a net positive social good. Look at the language in this sonnet. The word world appears in every single quatrain. The world will wail thee like a makeless wife. The world will be thy widow and still weep. Look what an unthrift in the world doth spend shifts but his place, for still the world enjoys it. But beauty's waste hath in the world an end. I'd argue that it's intentional that the word world appears in all the component parts of the sonnet except the concluding couplet. The world, quite literally, disappears if you fail to reproduce. The speaker, at least to my reading, is making two arguments here. The first and most obvious is that the production of children, procreation, is a social obligation. As I said, procreation is a positive social good. Think about it. By choosing not to procreate, you're depriving the world of another human, a potential friend, a potential lover, a potential poet, a potential scientist, and perhaps most importantly, you'd be depriving the world of a potential would-be internet English language arts teacher with a sub 100 subscriber count. Can we really afford to be missing out on all that? In the end, to be voluntarily antinatalist is to be antisocial and to be selfish. It's the imposition of your own negative worldview on future generations. I believe that's what the speaker is getting at in this poem, and I'm in support of what he's saying. Call me a cosmopolitan squish. But for me, expanding the human brotherhood is a good thing, and we should all do our part, if we can. The second argument the speaker makes in Sonnet No. 9 is a bit more subtle, but it's certainly there. The way that the speaker presents the young man's refusal to procreate as a great cosmic tragedy in this poem suggests that for the speaker, there is a teleological component to procreation. The young man's purpose on earth is to pass on his beauty to future generations through procreation. It is, according to the speaker, a murderous shame, a crime, that the young man consumes himself in single life. Teleologically speaking, the young man is not meant to live alone in singleness of life, but quite the contrary. He is meant to live a shared, mutual, communal life within the context of a family. This point is important. The young man is not meant to live single, but in commune with a family. Keep this in mind as we move forward in this video lesson. Okay, so that's the first reason why I go against the traditional critical treatment of Sonnet No. 9, its message. Now let's move on to the other reason why I believe this is a great poem, and that, of course, is its phonaesthetics. I'm sure you heard it when you read it out loud, but this poem is running all the classic language arts plays, just Kyle Shanahan levels of creative phonetic delight. To take just one example, this poem is rich, very rich indeed, in alliteration. Alliteration, if you've forgotten, is the repetition of initial consonant sounds in either consecutive or closely clustered words. Here in Sonnet No. 9, we find alliteration used in all but 4 lines of the poem. That's a lot of alliteration. Sometimes, like in the very first line, there are 3 instances of alliteration. I've highlighted all of the alliteration here in red for you to take a look at. Given that this poem is so resplendent with alliteration, it makes sense to talk for a little bit about the phonaesthetics of alliteration and why poets might employ it. Specifically, why does Shakespeare employ so much alliteration in this poem? When it comes to the tools of the English language arts, tools like alliteration, there is a rule that all poets must follow. Any English language arts tool, in order to be effective as a poetic device, must be employed as something more than mere phonetic phenomena. So alliteration, therefore, must also show some discernible semantic meaning in addition to just sounding nice. We can therefore say that a poem's phonaesthetics must be linked to its semantic meaning. Here's what Alexander Pope writes about the relationship between sound and semantics in poetry. These 4 lines are taken from Pope's excellent poem, An Essay in Criticism, a must-read for all aspiring poets if you ask me. I'll link to it down in the description if you're interested. Pope writes, "True ease in writing comes from art, not chance, as those move easiest who have learned to dance. 'Tis not enough no harshness gives offense, the sound must seem an echo to the sense." The sound must seem an echo to the sense. Precisely. The language arts tools that a poet employs, whether it be alliteration, assonance, consonance, rhymes, whatever. That language art must somehow relate to or support the semantic meaning of the poem. So what might be the reason that Shakespeare uses alliteration to support his larger meaning in Sonnet No. 9? To understand how alliteration might relate to the semantic meaning of Sonnet No. 9, we must recall where we are in the sonnet cycle. We're still in the so-called procreation sonnets. The main goal of the speaker in these sonnets is to convince the young man to reproduce. Alliteration, remember, is the reproduction of identical consonant sounds at the beginning of closely clustered words. So in the reproduction of these closely clustered phonemes, we have a thematic link to biological reproduction. This phonetic reproduction, as we've already pointed out, appears in all component parts of the sonnet except for the concluding couplet. That is, the 3 quatrains of the sonnet feature alliteration, heavy use of alliteration, but the concluding couplet does not. This is a perfect illustration of Pope's and ELA+'s rule of the necessity of a poem's phonaesthetics being related to its semantic meaning. In Sonnet No. 9, like in all the sonnets of the procreation sequence, the speaker aims to persuade the young man to reproduce. So in the 3 quatrains, there is heavy use of alliteration. Biological reproduction is linked to the phonaesthetics of initial consonant sound reproduction. Then in the concluding couplet, when the speaker argues that a shameful crime will be committed if the young man fails to reproduce, so too does the repetition of initial consonant sounds fail to reproduce. Shakespeare follows the rule. A poem's phonaesthetics must be linked to its semantic meaning. Further, and most importantly, we must observe that the most repeated use of alliteration in this poem is the repetition of the W consonant sound. I've highlighted these repetitions here for you. Why might Shakespeare so scrupulously use the repetition of the W consonant sound? I'd argue he does so for at least 2 reasons. First of all, it's a W, a double U. When one reproduces, has a child that is, the result is a double U. Further, a double is more than the single life that the speaker warns against in the opening quatrain. Remember that thematically speaking, the speaker argues that the teleological purpose of the young man is to abandon single life and join a family in a communal existence by means of biological reproduction. This is reflected in the reproduction of sound patterns in the poem's heavy use of alliteration, particularly in the near constant reproduction of the W sound. But this reproduction is not limited to the phonetics of the W sound. It's also reproduced typographically in this poem, as Helen Vendler points out. The fantasy on the letter W, as it could be entitled, arises, I believe, from Shakespeare's fascinated observation of the shape of the word widow, the quarto spelling. The initial and final W's of widow are mere images of each other, and its middle letter is repeated, DD, in self-identity. Shakespeare delighted with the properties of the word widow, and with the fact that W is a double U, and that V is internally printed U, and V is used for initial U in Elizabethan printing. This sets off a flurry of W's and U's and V's. Words containing more or less symmetrical parts like issueless and makeless and unused and bosom arise in the train of widow. The poem needs to be read in the quarto spelling, since in modern spelling some of the symmetries disappear. Compare widow, W-I-D-O-W, and widow, W-I-D-D-O-W, issueless, and issueless. Here is the quarto version of Sonnet No. 9. Feel free to pause the video here and get a better understanding of what Helen Vendler is talking about. Pay particular attention to those W's, V's, and U's. The upshot here is that Shakespeare uses alliteration in general, and the letter W specifically, both phonetically and typographically, to support the semantic meaning of Sonnet No. 9. And that about wraps up our analysis of the poem, but first, as always, we have to discuss the sonnet's couplet tie. There is only one couplet tie in Sonnet No. 9, and that is the word no. The word no appears in line 6 and line 13. This paltry word may seem so inconsequential as to not justify its inclusion as a couplet tie. But here's how Helen Vendler justifies describing it as a proper couplet tie. She writes, "Normally, such a small and insignificant word would not count as a couplet tie. However, since one of the themes of the sonnet is omission, the adjective no is a strong thematic word. Also, in its two occurrences, it appears in the same sort of phrase. No X plus preposition plus personal pronoun. No form of thee, line 6. No love toward others, line 13. So that the word no becomes mnemonically foregrounded in patterning." And that completes our video lesson on William Shakespeare's Sonnet No. 9. In this video lesson, first we read the poem. Then we offered a contemporary plain English rendering of the poem. After that, we briefly talked about the critical appraisal of the poem, and hopefully, I argued persuasively that this critical appraisal gets it wrong. In my attempt to critically rehabilitate Sonnet No. 9, I first endorsed its pro-social message, and then I delved into its phonaesthetics, choosing to focus on its heavy use of alliteration. After that, we wrapped things up with a discussion of its couplet tie. And now we'll end, as we always do, with some comprehension questions. Question 1. What do you think of this poem? Question 2. What part of the sonnet cycle as a whole does Sonnet No. 9 fit into? Question number 3. What is the murderous shame the speaker believes the young man to be committing? Question number 4. What is alliteration? And question number 5. Aside from alliteration, can you identify any other English language arts tool that Shakespeare employs in Sonnet No. 9? How might it relate to the overall theme or semantic meaning of the poem? That's our video lesson for William Shakespeare's Sonnet No. 9. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did enjoy it, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. ELA Plus is a free supplemental guide to English studies and the English language arts. We'll have regularly updated content, so be sure to activate the notifications. Until our next lesson, keep reading, get obsessed, and take care of yourselves and others. Thank you.